Television and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
This week on American Interests, a conversation with Kenneth Adelman, the director of the United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Should the United States move toward the early deployment of strategic defenses? And what effect would it have on the current round of U.S.-Soviet nuclear arms talks in Geneva?
I do believe that SDI and arms control go together, that SDI has been the influence driving the Soviets to good arms control proposals. So as soon as SDI comes along, I think that we can deploy it and should deploy it.
The Strategic Defense Initiative and the Geneva Arms Negotiations. From Washington, this is American Interests. American Interests is made possible by grants from IBM, Exxon, Avis Incorporated, and Pfizer Inc. Additional funding is provided by the Starr Foundation and the John M. Olin Foundation.
Welcome to American Interests. I'm Peter Krogh. At the Reykjavik Summit, President Reagan refused to confine the Strategic Defense Initiative to laboratory testing only for a period of 10 years. Now, just 4 months later, there is much talk in Washington about an early deployment of a first phase of a strategic defense system. With us to discuss the Strategic Defense Initiative and its relation to current U.S.-Soviet arms control negotiations in Geneva is Ambassador Kenneth Adelman, Director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Ambassador Adelman, there's a lot of talk in Washington, particularly on Capitol Hill and in the Pentagon, about an early deployment of the Strategic Defense Initiative, a first phase of it. Would you be in favor of that?
I think we should move the SDI program along as quickly as we can. I think this country needs protection. It needs protection of its leadership, protection of its strategic assets, and protection of it as a nation. I do believe that SDI and arms control go together, that SDI has been the influence driving the Soviets to good arms control proposals. So as soon as SDI comes along, I think that we can deploy it and should deploy it, as long as we know it's going to be a system that really helps reduce the risk of war.
What are the arguments for an early deployment of a first phase of a strategic defense system? And what would early mean?
Early would mean the middle of next decade. And the advantages would be that it would protect big parts of the United States and protect our country against an accidental or unauthorized launch by the Soviet Union. It would protect some of our strategic assets, some of our ports, some of our leadership, and would get us a little bit out of this situation that if nuclear weapons, God forbid, were ever coming into the United States, a president of the United States could do nothing about it.
Looking toward the mid-1990s, what would the first phase of a strategic defense system look like, and what would it consist of?
It would look like a deployment in two spheres. One is ground-based, with very large protection areas, and second is the boost phase, where we could get missiles as they lift off in the Soviet Union, get all the warheads in it, in those missiles at the same time. So it would be kind of a two-tier system.
And what technologies, principally, would be applied to that system?
They're looking now at kinetic kill capabilities, which is basically a rifle from space or a rifle from the ground. It's a little pellet.
It is suggested that if this administration doesn't make a decision for an early deployment of some phase of the Strategic Defense Initiative, that it will soon become a memory, that the next administration will cancel the Strategic Defense Initiative, that Congress will no longer be interested in providing funds for it.
There's something to that argument, although I don't buy it myself. I tend to be a lot cheerier and more optimistic than most of my conservative colleagues, some of whom were gloom and doom individuals. I think that the idea of SDI is one that is becoming and will become implanted in the body politic of the United States, that future administrations may not buy onto this particular blueprint for an SDI, but will research strategic defense and defense will be in our future. I think that a better argument, Peter, is that we have to start deploying something as soon as we can to protect our country, and every day that we don't protect it is a day more of danger.
At Reykjavik, Gorbachev and Reagan were arguing about whether SDI ought to be confined to the laboratory for a period of 10 years. Was that argument a real argument, or have both sides really gone out of the laboratory with components of their strategic defense systems?
Let me just tell you, to those of us with the president at the Hofty House, it seemed like a real argument to us. The Soviets were insistent that we kill SDI research by confining it to the laboratory. And in my mind, as I told the president at the time, it's like asking General Motors to confine its research to the laboratory. Well, there's something you can do on windshields in the laboratory. There's something you can do with the wheels in the laboratory. Something you can do with motors. But eventually, before you start marketing a car, you're going to want to drive the thing. You're going to want to take it out of the hangar, take it out of the factory, and spin it around the block. And unless you can do that, you're not going to have a car on the street.
What have the Soviets got in terms of strategic system capability, defense system capability?
Well, they have poured 15 times what we have over the years. They have...
What does this produce?
What this produces 100 interceptors that gives them a capability for ballistic missile defense right now around Moscow. That's legal according...
That's permitted under the ABM.
That's permitted according to the ABM treaty, but it's still a capability that complicates our planning and provides them with some strategic defense in that. Secondly, they have done a lot of research on ground-based lasers. They've done a lot of research on some other highfalutin advanced technologies and scientific areas. They've done a tremendous program about boosting large payloads into space. They talk about not militarizing space, and this cliche gets around, and people who are opposed to SDI use it in the United States. Fact is, the Soviets have all kinds of military assets in space. 80% of their space launches are for military purposes, and what they're objecting about, Peter, is not so much SDI. What they're objecting about is our SDI program. They like their SDI. They like their own SDI program.
We have already signed some contracts with our allies to participate in research and development of components of the Strategic Defense Initiative. What is the Soviet reaction to this?
They don't like it one bit. They put a lot of pressure on our allies to stop collaborating with us on SDI, and it scares the dickens out of the Soviets when they see the United States research program in collaboration with the Japanese, with the Europeans, and with others, because we are good at high tech. That's our comparative advantage. It's always been our comparative advantage.
What possibility do you assign to the temptation that an early deployment of the Strategic Defense Initiative would offer to them to conduct a preemptive first strike?
Zero. I think it's absurd. We did
but
research.
This is an argument that opponents of the SDI are making.
Ridiculous argument. We had a research program in the early 1970s. They never attacked our research program, the Safeguard and the Sentinel at that time. We had, before, a tremendous strategic superiority with the Soviet Union. When they started to get assets, they would go after our capabilities in any sense. It is a big deal going after the other superpower. The one thing that the United States and the Soviet Union have really avoided since World War II is any brushing up against each other in tension areas around the world, let alone direct conflict. We both realize how serious this is. And to go around scaring ourselves to death by saying, well, the Soviets would pick off the SDI program once we start to build it is just absurd.
On the other side of the argument, Secretary Weinberger has suggested that an early deployment of a first phase of the strategic defense system could help drive some deep reductions in the current nuclear arsenals of both sides.
I think he's right. I think he's right on that.
How would that work?
It would work because SDI has been the engine driving the Soviets to make proposals for deep reductions. We tried for years as a government to get the Soviets to reduce nuclear weapons and arms control rather than to legitimize a buildup they were going to do otherwise. And I think that only since SDI came along Have they been willing to have reductions of arms control in arms control? And I think that the greater progress we get in SDI, the better off we'll be in arms control.
Well, in this sense, then, is the objective to get SDI off the negotiating table by getting it deployed?
I think it will help our negotiations to have the greater progress in SDI. And I've always felt that.
Now, what would a negotiation that traded mutual assured destruction, which is where we now are, for mutual assured survival, how would a negotiation like that work? Would there be a phased build-down of offensive weapons and a phased build-up of strategic defenses on both sides?
That's what we would like. We would like a cooperative transition with the Soviets where we share information on defenses, we share the benefits of the research on defenses, and we go down on the offensive side, up on the defensive side, till we get a more secure world. The Soviets have told us that they don't like that cooperative transition very much, and they're not going to cooperate with us. But that's our vision.
You apparently feel that you've brought the Soviets along quite a distance over the past 6 years. How do you justify your claims for real progress in arms control?
Because we are doing something in Geneva, Peter, that no administration has ever done in history. We are talking to the Soviets about deep reductions of nuclear weapons and reducing the risk of war. Before, arms control was always at a level way up here. It allowed both sides to build pretty much as they wanted to build without any limitations. And we said that's lousy arms control. To get good arms control, we must have the kind of reductions. The Soviets said niet, niet, niet for 4 years. Our critics here in the United States said, we're just dreaming. We'll never get the Soviets to talk about deep reductions. And we're putting up non-negotiable demands. Right now, our negotiators in Geneva are negotiating over precisely what was considered non-negotiable 3 years ago.
Well, they're talking, but they appear to be stalemated. There doesn't seem to have been any real progress from Reykjavik to Vienna to Geneva.
I think there has been indications that the Soviets are more serious than they were in Vienna, or more serious than they were last round. I think they have upgraded their delegation with Mr. Vorontsov. They are trying to strip away some of the stultified atmosphere of the talks right now, having more working groups, having more real outline of where there are areas of agreement, where there are areas of disagreement, the kind of things that they would do if they were serious about arms control, kind of things that they have not done in the past. Now, that's not to say we know that they're going to have an agreement with us in this administration. We don't know that, and there's a long ways to go. But we do know they're acting as if they want an agreement.
What are the discussions turning around at this point? What are the sticking points at the working level? We know what the sticking point is at the summit, but what are some of the sticking points at the working level?
One is verification, so we know whether they're complying or not. 2 is their compliance record. That's pretty dismal that they cheat on arms control, in essence. 3 is what we call sublimits in START, which is limitation on the biggest land-based missiles, the land-based missiles that are most troublesome to us. 4th is the linkage between START, strategic reductions, and SDI, and the linkage between INF, the intermediate range forces, and SDI. They delinked, that means untied the INF and SDI for a year or so. Now they've retied it since Reykjavik, so they've actually pulled back from their position before. And 5thly, some short-range systems on INF and a host of more minor. But those are the 5 big issues that we're facing in Geneva today.
Well, let's pick up on some of these issues. On the verification question. What do we want? And isn't our strategic defense initiative a hedge against the inability to verify, in a sense?
I think it is a hedge against the inability to verify if we get down to very low limits and if we get the SDI in place. I think what we need for good verification is greater openness in the Soviet Union. The ability to have on-site inspection, the ability to leave people there, the ability to have monitors in place, and the general openness, the kind that Gorbachev has talked about now, but we haven't seen in deeds.
And with respect to compliance, if their record of compliance is so dismal in the past, why are we even playing the game?
Because we are playing the game by telling them that they have to clean up their act in compliance. They have to stop cheating in arms control agreements that we have now. Otherwise, we just cannot conclude good agreements with them in the future. We have put down the marker, we have said that, and they better get the message.
Ambassador Adelman, I understood that your feeling about the greatest danger of the ABM Treaty was that it consigned us to an era of vulnerability. That is, it prevented us or prevents us from developing a full-blown strategic defense system, and therefore results in a doctrine of deterrence that depends on our vulnerability rather than our safety. Isn't that the problem with it? Isn't it fundamentally contrary to the requirements of going toward mutually assured survival?
If we can move the SDI program the way I think we can, then the ABM regime would have to be changed. We're not at that point now to know that in particular. We're not at the point now to know that the Soviets wouldn't be interested themselves in some kind of change. At Reykjavik, the president spent a good deal of time talking to Mr. Gorbachev about the right of each side after 10 years to deploy an SDI system unless there is mutual agreement not to.
There has been talk, I don't know whether it's been within the administration or in academic circles, about, quote, turning Glassboro upside down, turning the Glassboro summit upside down.
Well,
what does that really mean? What does that refer to, and what does it mean?
I think that's the direction that we're going, to tell you the truth. That Glassboro was basically a lecture by Lyndon Johnson to Kosygin, saying that defenses were bad. Greater safety lies in greater vulnerability. And what this president is saying is defenses are good. Greater safety does not lie in greater vulnerability. Greater safety lies in greater invulnerability. There is nothing immoral, destabilizing, or provocative about protecting ourselves and protecting our country. I mean, ye gods, we don't have policemen on the street with bulletproof vests, people saying that putting on a bulletproof vest for policemen is provocative to a robber.
So this is really a 180 degree shift. And the problem is, how do you make the turn?
And you make the turn gradually and over time and based on a sound strategic sense, a sound arms control sense, and a sound technological base so that you can do this.
You mentioned earlier that several of the issues that are stopping progress in Geneva in the arms control field have to do with the requirements for openness in the Soviet Union. What evidence is there that there is more openness in the Soviet Union under Gorbachev?
Well, there are speeches that Mr. Gorbachev has given. There's some indication that the big names in the dissident movement have been let go. Orlov, Sharansky, Sakharov is allowed to come to Moscow instead of Gorky. But still, Peter, you have 4,000 to 10,000 political prisoners in the Soviet Union. Over half of them have been arrested since Gorbachev got there. There are still people confined to psychiatric wards and mental hospitals because of their political beliefs. You still have a system that is among the most repressive in the world today. That is true in Eastern Europe as well. The fact is that the conditions in Bulgaria, conditions in Poland, conditions in Czechoslovakia, where unfortunately our Deputy Secretary of State is now, are very harsh conditions, and we shouldn't legitimize those governments or give them any more due than we need to.
Well, what is going on with Gorbachev? Is he simply just generating a lot of smoke, or are we dealing here with someone who is different in kind for us to deal with? More adroit, clever, able to exploit public opinion in the West, and also tactically more clever than his predecessors.
I think that's undoubtedly true. I think we have a new type of Soviet leader in the sense that you put it perfectly, Peter. He has been on a charm offensive, which was easy for him to do because he's really, my experience in 2 summits has been he's kind of an attractive individual. Compared to Andropov, compared to the dying Brezhnev, compared to Chernenko, it's not hard to do. I mean,
because he's actually breathing and walking around.
He's alive, for one thing, and that's a big advantage. He's the first Soviet leader in a long time that weighs more than his wife, for another thing. And he's just a clever kind of individual. Now, we have been in the West constantly looking and longing for a change in basic Soviet policy. Bert Marshall, who we probably both know, who advised Dean Acheson in the State Department, did a study recently in which he found that in the post-war era, some 53 times a president or a secretary of state have said that it's a new day and a new dawn in U.S.-Soviet relations. It's a turning point because of changes in the Soviet Union. Now, if one of those 53 times had panned out, we wouldn't be in the pickle we're in today. But we're very hopeful people. We're always looking for signs and everything. The fact that the Soviet Union is as repressive as it is today gives it room for improvement, as my grandfather used to say about my report card. It had room for improvement. This is room for improvement in the Soviet Union on its behavior towards individuals. But we have to see it. We have to see it in arms control in particular. We need better openness if we're going to have an arms control agreement in the future. We need on-site inspection. We need truthful giving of figures on how many weapon systems they have, an ability to monitor those systems with equipment. We need arms control openness to help us in arms control.
Can all of that openness be achieved and still have the Soviet repression of basic human rights continue?
I don't believe it can. And so therefore I think that they will make these moves and make these statements, but not really take any real actions to change the system. But I hope that's wrong. I hope they do. I think that it's wonderful for them to let dissidents go. I think it's wonderful for Gorbachev to be talking about greater openness. But I just want to see him do it before I believe it.
You've been on the watch here in arms control for about 6 years now, and spending quite a lot of this time dealing with the Soviet Union and its changing leadership. What are some of the lessons you have learned about negotiating with the Soviet Union, dealing with the Soviet Union over this period of time?
First and foremost lesson is you have to be patient. These people are very solid negotiators. They will talk you to death. They realize that the Americans are an impatient people, always looking for results. We play Pac-Man, they play chess. They have a much slower pace than we do. We cannot be hurly-burly in this. Secondly, they look for resolve on our part. To give up a weapon system unilateral is to them not a sign of goodwill, but it's a sign of a lack of will. Thirdly, they're looking for ways to divide us from the Allies, to play our open political system in such a way as to distance the President from the Congress. I think when you look on the horizon of arms control, the damage that the Congress could do to this process is severe.
Now, the President made some reference to that in his State of the Union address, that Congress should not enact the Soviet negotiating agenda.
That's right.
What did he mean by that?
What I meant by that is time after time, the Congress goes and they enact into law Soviet proposals. We were at Reykjavik the day before the opening of the talks there, and instead of spending additional time with President resting and to get the last minute kind of briefings and the last minute kind of adjustments, that we needed for the talks the next day, we spent that day, that Friday, negotiating with the Congress. Why? Because the Armed Services Committees of the House and the Senate were together in a conference committee. They wanted to know what the administration supported or didn't support on arms control proposals and arms control amendments. Basically, what the House wanted to do was not to strengthen the president's hand, but to tie his hands. And we got the best deal we could. We gave up the research on the anti-satellite program that very day. The next morning, the president spends the morning with Gorbachev alone. He comes in to talk to 6 or 7 of us, and he says that Gorbachev made a big point about negotiations on an anti-satellite ban. And I said to the president at that time, tell him it's a done deal. Tell him the Congress just legislated that yesterday. And they have. And that's no way to negotiate. If we just remove any incentive for them to be serious on arms control, they're not going to be serious about arms control.
So when we're negotiating with the Soviet Union, we've got 3 negotiations going on simultaneously, effectively, with the Soviets, with our own executive branch, and with the Congress.
And then you have the Allies thrown in.
And so the Allies do their own thing. Tough.
Makes it very tough.
You mentioned that patience and resolve is required for negotiating with the Soviet Union. Do you think we've got a president who some believe is now weakened, who is able to show patience and able to show resolve, or is he going to want a deal?
He wants a deal if the deal is clearly in the U.S. national interest, and he doesn't want a deal if it's a bad one. He has let us know right when I came into this job, and almost every time since that no arms control agreement is much better than a bad arms control agreement. Listen, Peter, we've had enough bad arms control agreements. It's not going to be a historical contribution of the Reagan administration to add yet one more bad arms control agreement. Let other administrations do that work. We'll do other work.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Adelman. Till next week, for American Interests, I'm Peter Krogh.
American Interests is made possible by grants from IBM, Exxon, Avis Incorporated, and Pfizer Inc. Additional funding is provided by the Starr Foundation and the John M. Olin Foundation. Videocassette copies of American Interests can be obtained from the Blackwell Corporation, 1255 23rd Street Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20037. For a transcript of this program, send $3 in a self-addressed stamped envelope to Rapid Transcript, P.O. Box 70808, Washington, D.C., 20024. Please specify program topic. This program was produced by the Blackwell Corporation, which is solely responsible for its content.
Wednesday on Iowa Public Television.
I'm Peter Graves. On Discover the World of Science, see the very latest in transportation, walking robots. Also, raccoons and rabies. There's a major epidemic, but could animals vaccinate themselves? An old game with a new twist from student engineers, mechanical tug of war. So join me next time on Discover the World of Science.
At segregated lunch counters, black students sat down and refused to leave. At segregated bus depots, freedom riders like Frederick Leonard risk beatings and arrest.
The judge turned around, bam, 60 days in the state penitentiary.
Ain't scared of your jails. Next time on Eyes on the Prize.
The sun shines bright on our Jim Wright, deep in the heart of Texas.
He speaks for Fort Worth. He speaks for the